Okay, so we've come to the last talk of this last afternoon session. So next speaker is Erick Gantt, and he's gonna speak about the Fidelity Pointwise Flashpoint updates and 2024 new features. So please, Erick, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Hello to everyone there from North America. I'm sorry I didn't put my name here on the title slide. That was a little negligent. As mentioned, I'm Erick Gantt. I'm an applications engineer at Cadence Design Systems, and have been associated with Pointwise, the product, for many years, both at Cadence and prior as the company Pointwise. I just wanted to mention real quick here, since sometimes it's still new to some folks, that Fidelity Pointwise is just kind of a slightly new branding for the Pointwise software, but the software is essentially the same for those of you that have used it over the years. And I do promise, even though I am the closing presentation, I will not launch into a 1-hour training session and go into your dinner time. So, as mentioned in the title, I kind of wanted to give just a brief overview of what we refer to as our Flashpoint tools in Pointwise. The suite of tools that we've developed over the course of the last 2 or 3 versions of Fidelity Pointwise are intended to provide a higher level of automation to all of the tool set that Pointwise has had over the years that gives users a lot of detail control over their meshing or pre-processing. And so this automation is one of the 2 primary thrusts of our last few major version releases, and the other one has been performance, and we'll talk about that shortly in the kind of the middle of the presentation. So as an overview of the Flashpoint tools, on the left-hand side, you see an acronym AQA that stands for Assisted Quilt Assembly. This is the capability that went in our last major version, 2023, which provides the tools for users to take their geometry that they've imported into Pointwise and more rapidly organize and assemble that geometry into what we refer to as quilts in Pointwise, which will become meshing regions. And hopefully you can see the cursor. So in the top of this image on the left, this is kind of the original surface arrangement or quilting as it's imported into Pointwise. And then in the bottom image here, this is after the assisted quilt assembly, which uses a lot of tools that were developed for this middle column, automatic surface mesh, to analyze the geometry and basically qualify boundaries in the geometry for curvature or hard edges, convex, concave, and use that information to use the flood fill tool to help you with this assembly process. And again, more rapidly generate those meshing regions in your geometry. That information and the naming of the quilts that you have in your geometry feeds into the original Flashpoint tool that we released, which is automatic surface mesh here in the middle. Automatic surface mesh is designed to take a really large number of the detailed tools and creation controls that Pointwise has and incorporate some best practices that we've developed over the years ourselves and from our customers, and be able to essentially set up a recipe for the surface meshing using the quilting information that you have over here, and then generating very quickly a very high quality surface grid from that recipe that takes into account curvature, convexity again, and automatically resolve the surface mesh for you and give you nice, smooth transitions between different surface grids in the mesh, and to do that as rapidly, of course, as possible. And again, the naming that came from the quilting that you've generated at the outset follows through automatic surface mesh, and all of the surface grids retain that naming for the topology of your grid. And that will feed into the last Flashpoint feature that we've developed, which is automatic volume mesh. Automatic volume mesh is designed to help you set up the topology creation for your volume grid in Pointwise so that you can skip essentially a lot of the more tedious hand creation that was required previously. And so instead of generating all of these boundaries and edges for your far field and setting up these surface grids for those boundaries, automatic volume mesh does that for you. It figures out all of those things based on the dimensions that you give it for your boundaries and sets up all the topology automatically. It predetermines symmetry grids and so on. So it sets up your volume grid for you very quickly. So this is just kind of an overview of the Flashpoint tools. Again, these automatic surface mesh was the original a few versions back, and then automatic volume mesh was released. And then in 2023, we released the assisted quilt assembly tool. And so what I want to do next is just kind of briefly talk about a few additional changes that we made to those three tools at the end of the previous version 2023, and you can see that notated on the next few slides, 2023.2. So the first update that we made here was to essentially extend that capability that AQA has to classify your boundaries for you based on curvature or convex or concave boundaries, so that it would take advantage of the original trimming tools that Pointwise has had for a number of years, trim by surfaces and trim by curves. Those trimming tools now, the boundaries that are created from those, automatically feeds into AQA, and it will classify those as blocking boundaries. The assumption is that whenever you're trimming your geometry in Pointwise, that more than likely you want the boundaries from those new trims to become hard boundaries for your quilting that you're going to do in assisted quilt assembly. And you can kind of see that in the table in AQA here. And on the right-hand side, I've just kind of pointed out these trimming tools, trim by surfaces, trim by curves, and trim geometrically, which was newly released with assisted quilt assembly when it came out. And I talked about those tools last year at this conference. So if you were attending last year, you may remember that discussion. So for automatic surface mesh, we realized we had a deficiency in generating meshes using a tool in automatic surface mesh called refinement factor. This became obvious to us in the last year or so. We've been participating in some workshops, a high lift workshop and drag prediction and so on. And making mesh families, we realized that as we use this refinement factor, which is essentially intended to be a global refinement tool in ASM, it was not really addressing these special boundaries or special surfaces that ASM treats, which we call thin surfaces or narrow surfaces, like the trailing edge of a control surface, a wing, for instance. There's special tools in ASM to allow you to specify a specific number of cells or points across those surfaces, and our refinement factor was not automatically adjusting that for you when you were doing a refinement or coarsening a mesh, for instance. Now that does take effect. If you change the refinement factor, it does appropriately scale the number of subdivisions on these types of surfaces for you in your surface mesh. And then the last change for the Flashpoint tools that I wanted to update on is an automatic volume mesh. Again, released this feature in the 2022 version of Pointwise. We realized, especially from user feedback, that we left out the capability that we really needed to have. Automatic volume mesh was essentially determining a centroid for your far field boundary based on the surface grids that you brought into this command. And we realized that if a user brought in a slightly different set of surface grids, perhaps the geometry changes slightly, but they want to have the same centroid and, of course, the same far-field boundary from grid to grid, they need to be able to specify that center point themselves directly, and that's what we were missing. So we added this at the end of 2023 version so that users can specify now that center point for their far boundaries directly. And so that's been a nice update there for consistency and meshing. All right. So that brings me to 2024. And I will mention here, kind of on this introduction slide, that some of the performance that I'm going to talk about was already incorporated in 2023, but the major changes for performance in Pointwise have come out just this summer in 2024. And I'm going to show you some performance slides in just a minute. But this slide does note a couple of things here, relative to 2023 and 2022, which was 2 versions back. So 3.5 times speed up to last version, 2023, and 5 times, and you'll see sometimes more compared to 2022. And this is specifically for our anisotropic portion of volume meshing, so near your wall boundaries or adjacent to your walls. In addition to that, in 2024, we've also made our voxel meshing, which is kind of a hex core isotropic volume meshing capability that we have in Pointwise. We sped it up. It's about 2 times faster compared to the previous release. And it's also a little bit more robust for a few corner cases that we have run into in the last few years. And then finally, in addition to the performance capabilities, the WC smoothing that was originally developed for our high order export of meshes, which we've also applied to general smoothing of unstructured volume grids. We've made this capability a little bit more robust for the smoothing tool for 2023.2. I mean, it's compared to 2023.2. In addition to that change in robustness, we've also added another control, which I'm going to show you in the next slide, that gives you explicit control over whether our anisotropic region of the volume grid is smoothed during that process. So this is I think the only slide I have that kind of shows a couple of panels from the interface of Pointwise. And on the left-hand side, we're looking at the solve command, which is essentially where you initialize your volume grids, your unstructured volume grids in Pointwise. And specifically, the attributes tab is selected here at the top. And then down here at the bottom, I have highlighted this freeze T-Rex cells capability. So this is the new feature I mentioned for the smoothing tool for unstructured volumes. You can now tell it to freeze T-Rex volume cells either by their aspect ratio. You can have them all frozen, the entire anisotropic layer, or you can turn it off so that it's going to continue to be smooth, which was the case prior to this release. On the right-hand side, we can see this is the T-Rex tab in the same command panel. We have all the settings for the anisotropic meshing. And in the advanced frame down at the bottom, we have all of our acceleration or performance tools. The one at the top here where it uses subdivisions to skip layers while it's, to essentially skip quality checks while it's advancing over a certain number of layers. That was the first performance capability that we added. The second checkbox here is use collision prediction. That came out in 2023, where it would go through before it starts advancing the anisotropic cells and try to determine when it actually needs to start collision prediction instead of doing it with every layer, which provided a significant speed up. But the primary speed up that's gone in, which is in 2024, is this last checkbox that's called Use Bulk Deformation. Essentially, in 2024, we've changed the T-Rex advancing front to take advantage of multiple cores on your workstation. And so now it's essentially advancing the entire front in parallel on those cores, which is significantly speeded up the anisotropic portion of our volume meshing endpoint-wise. In this particular image, I've shown that the first two tools are off. Essentially, the skipping sublayers is set to quality, which is the default. You can see the checkbox on the right. And then use collision prediction is actually also off by default. And this is for new sessions that you may start or new projects. These will be the default settings. If you've already used these in a previous project and you import it to Pointwise, it'll maintain those settings. But we've found that generally use bulk deformation capability, which is advancing your front in parallel on course, is the best performance in general for most cases. So these are really the only two UI or GUI changes that you'll see in the interface for Pointwise in 2024.1, which is came out this summer, because most of the work for this release has been kind of in the background for performance improvement. And so I have a couple of slides here that kind of gives you an overview. The proof is in the pudding, as they say, in terms of what you're really getting out. And so what we did was we ran a number of cases from one of the high lift prediction workshop configurations. And these charts are showing 4 grid levels, A through D. And here on the left, you can see the cell counts for these 4 grid levels. And on the right are the node counts. And so we're ranging from about 48 million cells at level A here, 29 million nodes, up to the largest level D grid, which is about 950 million cells. And on the right-hand side here, nodes, that's about 700 million nodes. And you can kind of see an image of the configuration up here on the top right. And so on the next slide, we have the performance improvements. And I just want to note that these numbers are relative to version 2022. So there was, as I mentioned, some performance work that was done in version 2023. And so we really wanted to show the delta to 2022 from the current release. And we also did that because we have a number of users that are still working at the 2022 version level. And so down here at the bottom on the left, you can see the block total time. So these are hours it took to initialize the entire block. That's both the T-Rex or anisotropic portion and the isotropic portion in the remainder of the volume. And so I'll just kind of skip over to the largest case here on the right-hand side. And so the block total time for the level D grid was originally about 72 hours, so about 3 days for that case, just under 1 billion cells, dropped down to about 8.5 hours in the current release. So multiple days down to significantly less than a day. And over here on the right, you can see the speed up, and actually as the grid size increases, you get even more performance speed up for the case. So for the largest case here, it's a little over 8 times speed up. And this is, again, just for initializing that volume grid, the anisotropic and the isotropic portions. Up here in this little chart in the top right, this is just kind of showing the total mesh generation time. And even here for the level D, it's still really only about 8.5, or 8.75 hours, I believe, to do both the surface meshing and the volume meshing. Of course, the surface meshing doesn't take nearly as long as the volume meshing portion. And that really is the bulk of the mesh process or pre-processing in Pointwise, because for all of these cases, the geometry was prepared ahead of time. So each of the levels uses the same geometry, so there's no need to redo that work for every mesh. So that's kind of the overview of the performance improvement. Again, major change or improvement capability for 2024.1. And so that's really all I had. It's a kind of a brief overview for kind of the end of version 2023 and what we've just released this summer for 2024 Fidelity Pointwise. So I do have my information here on this closing slide. If anyone has additional questions that we don't take care of today, feel free to reach out to me at Cadence. I did include a URL for those of you who are using Pointwise. This is a really handy URL to go directly to all things Pointwise on our Cadence website, and then just some more general information about Cadence's CFD tools in the last link. So with that, I'm a little long, but I think we have a minute or two for some questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Erick.
Yep.
So yes, Tom.
I have a question. So for the largest case that you showed, if you go back to your performance slide, of the, let's say I don't know exactly what it was, 8 hours, let's say roughly, what percent is the boundary layer, the T-Rex, versus the tenant soft body, and the rest of the body grid?
That's a very good question. Let me see if I can recall. It's not coming to me. I can probably pull it up in just a second. Is there another question while I'm trying to see if I can find that?
Any other question from the audience? Yes, Andrea? I can come here.
Do you think that having a surface mesh is a stretch anisotropically, like coming from a surface refinement, is going to impact too much the quality of T-Rex extrusion?
I didn't quite get all of that. Can you repeat the question for me?
Just one second. Be careful.
So if I use a surface mesh that is anisotropically refined, so it's a little bit stretched, and it's not like anisotropic from a T-Rex surface, but you have triangles stretched in one direction. Do you think it impacts the quality of the T-Rex or not? Or the T-Rex layer, I mean.
So I'm still not sure I understand the question, but automatic surface mesh does take advantage of 2D T-Rex or anisotropic meshing, and that surface mesh can be set up to be either all triangles, or you can set it up to generate quads for that anisotropic area. So essentially, it'll march it as triangles, but then it'll recombine everything that it can back into quads in those areas if you wish to have that, and you can do that. And you can also set it up to use a quad dominant isotropic mesh in the remainder of the surface grid, or you can leave it split so that it uses quads for the aniso area and triangles for the rest. But in general, the method as it's advancing those cells from the initial boundary, it does have very high quality anisotropic cells. There's almost always a right angle there, which is what makes it easy to combine those into quads when it's finished. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, kind of, but okay, I get your point. No worries.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, email me if you've got more questions. I'm happy to answer any more questions. And to go back to Tom's question, so the portion of the initialization of the volume for the largest case was about 3.6 hours. So that's out of about 8.5 hours. So it's somewhere between a third to, not quite a half of the time.
Good. Sound good.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sure.
Any other question? No? Okay, so we can thank the speaker again. Thank you, Erick.
Thank you. Thank you.